This is a developing situation that has the entire international community on high alert. We are tracking urgent reports coming out of Washington and the Middle East that suggest the long-simmering tensions between the United States and Iran have just reached a critical boiling point. Intelligence sources are indicating a significant shift in posture at the Pentagon, and diplomatic channels are reportedly going dark. This is not just another cycle of rhetoric. The indicators we are seeing right now point to a potential miscalculation that could spiral into the most significant military confrontation the region has seen in decades. Moments ago, information began to surface regarding specific military movements in the Persian Gulf that directly contradict the de-escalation narratives we have heard in recent weeks. The atmosphere in Washington is tense, with emergency briefings being held on Capitol Hill. The question that has haunted the geopolitical landscape for years is no longer hypothetical. Are we witnessing the final collapse of diplomacy and the beginning of a kinetic conflict? The stakes could not be higher. We are talking about the disruption of global energy supplies, the potential activation of proxy forces across the Levant, and a direct test of American military resolve in a volatile election cycle. What makes this moment particularly dangerous is the fog of uncertainty surrounding the decision-making process. For years, the world has watched a high-stakes game of poker played between Washington and Tehran, a game defined by bluffs, maximum pressure campaigns, and covert operations. But tonight, analysts are warning that the era of bluffing may be over. The red lines that were drawn in the sand have been crossed, and the response mechanisms are being primed. This is breaking news. But to understand where we are going in the next 24 hours, we must understand the dangerous game of brinkmanship that brought us to this precipice. This story is moving fast, and the implications are global. Markets are already reacting, and military assets are on the move. But beneath the headlines lies a more complex, terrifying reality about how wars start in the modern age, often not by design, but by a catastrophic misreading of the opponent's hand. We are going live to the heart of this crisis to dissect the reality behind the threats. This is the story of how a strategy of intimidation can suddenly and violently become real. To understand why the threat of a U.S. strike on Iran remains a tangible, breathing reality despite years of dismissive analysis, we have to look past the podiums and press conferences. We have to look at the psychology of the bluff. For a long time, the prevailing theory in foreign policy circles was that Donald Trump's strategy was rooted entirely in the performance of dominance. The idea that if you scream loud enough and hold a big enough stick, the other side will fold without a single shot being fired. It is the classic madman theory, modernized for the digital age. Convince your adversary that you are volatile enough to do the unthinkable, so they capitulate out of fear. However, history has a way of punishing those who rely too heavily on theatricality. The assumption that the United States is merely posturing is the single most dangerous variable in this equation. When Tehran convinces itself that Washington is paralyzed by domestic politics or a reluctance to enter another forever war, they feel emboldened to push the envelope. They accelerate uranium enrichment, they harass commercial shipping in the Strait of Hormuz, and they empower militias in Iraq and Syria to strike American assets. They bank on the bluff. But what we are seeing now is the breakdown of that gamble. The United States has signaled that the buffer zone is gone. The patience for gray zone warfare, attacks that are just below the threshold of open war, has evaporated. This brings us to the core of the current crisis. The danger isn't necessarily that the White House wants a war. The danger is that the bluffs have lost their potency, leaving military action as the only remaining tool to restore deterrence. When you threaten fire and fury but do not act, you lose credibility. When you draw a red line and let it be crossed, you invite aggression. We are now in a phase where the United States feels compelled to reestablish that red line in blood. The maximum pressure campaign was never just about economic sanctions. It was about backing Iran into a corner where they would either surrender their nuclear ambitions or lash out. They have chosen to lash out. And now the bluff is being called. Consider the events that have led us here. It wasn't a straight line, it was a jagged trajectory of near misses. We remember the downing of the U.S. surveillance drone, a sophisticated piece of military technology blasted out of the sky. At that moment, retaliatory jets were in the air only to be called back minutes before impact. To the casual observer, that looked like restraint. To hardliners in Tehran, it looked like weakness. It reinforced the narrative that the U.S. was a paper tiger, unwilling to risk a wider conflict. That single event, that hesitation, planted the seeds for the escalation we are witnessing today. It created a false sense of security among the Iranian leadership that they could strike without consequence. But that calculation failed to account for the erratic nature of American response. The assassination of Qasem Soleimani was the shock to the system that shattered the bluff narrative. It proved that the U.S. was willing to decapitate the leadership of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps in broad daylight on foreign soil. That strike didn't lead to World War III immediately, but it fundamentally changed the rules of engagement. It removed the guardrails. Now, every threat issued by the US carries the weight of that Hellfire missile. The Iranians know that the capability and the will exist, but they are trapped in their own cycle of escalation to save face. This is the trap. Two adversaries, both convinced they cannot afford to look weak, spiraling toward a collision that neither can fully control. We must also look at the geopolitical chessboard that surrounds this potential strike. This is not happening in a vacuum. Israel has been conducting a shadow war against Iranian nuclear facilities and scientists for over a decade. They have been pressuring Washington to take the lead, warning that the window to stop a nuclear-armed Iran is closing. Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states are watching nervously, knowing they are within range of Iran's vast ballistic missile arsenal. The pressure on the White House isn't just coming from designated hawks. It is coming from allies who feel abandoned and vulnerable. They are demanding action. They are demanding that the U.S. proving its security guarantees are not just words on paper. The intelligence community has long warned of the commitment trap. This occurs when a leader makes a threat so public and so severe that failing to execute it becomes a political suicide. The rhetoric regarding Iran has been absolute. Phrases like obliteration and end of Iran have been thrown around. When you use that language, you strip away your own diplomatic off-ramps. You box yourself in. If Iran takes one step too far, hits a base, sinks a tanker, harms an American citizen, the U.S. administration cannot simply send a sternly worded letter. They have promised fire. The electorate expects strength. The bluff transforms into a binding contract for war. And let's talk about the weaponry involved, because this is where the reality of the threat becomes terrifyingly physical. We are not talking about a ground invasion with thousands of troops landing on the beaches. The modern American strike package is designed for shock and awe, without the footprint. We are looking at Tomahawk cruise missiles launched from submarines that are currently lurking silently beneath the waters of the Arabian Sea. We are looking at B-2 Spirit stealth bombers that can take off from Missouri, fly halfway around the world, deliver massive ordnance on fortified underground bunkers, and return home without ever appearing on a radar screen. The targets are already mapped. The Pentagon maintains what is known as a TDL, a target deck list. It includes command and control centers, radar installations, missile batteries, and, most controversially, nuclear research sites buried deep within mountains. These plans are updated daily. When we hear about threats, we often think of abstract political maneuvering. But for the pilots and sailors in the region, the threat is a set of coordinates programmed into a guidance system. The machinery of war is already in motion. It is merely waiting for the final authorization code. The scary truth is that the infrastructure for a strike is more prepared than the infrastructure for a new diplomatic deal. But what happens the day after? This is the question that usually pauses the hand over the red button. However, in the current climate, the fear of what comes next is being outweighed by the fear of inaction. Proponents of a strike argue that a short, sharp blow would degrade Iran-OID's capabilities and force them back to the negotiating table, a strategy known as escalate to de-escalate. It is a high-stakes theory that assumes the enemy is rational. It assumes that after taking a massive hit, the Iranian regime will calculate that survival is more important than revenge. But history is littered with wars started by rational actors who miscalculated the pride and pain threshold of their enemies. We are also seeing a domestic dimension in the United States that cannot be ignored. The political landscape is fractured. A president under pressure often looks abroad to demonstrate resolve. The rally round the flag effect is a documented political phenomenon. While no administration admits to launching missiles for poll numbers, the perception of strength is a currency in Washington. If the administration feels that it is being perceived as weak or ineffective on the world stage, the temptation to use military force to reset the narrative becomes overwhelming. The bluffing strategy only works if you are winning. When you are losing the narrative, the missiles tend to fly. The human element of this story is often lost in the strategic analysis, but it is the most critical part. We are talking about thousands of U.S. service members stationed in Iraq, Syria, Qatar, and Bahrain who are effectively sitting in the crosshairs. If the U.S. launches a strike, these bases become immediate targets for Iranian ballistic missiles. We saw a glimpse of this after the Soleimani killing, when Al-Assad Air Base was hammered by Iranian missiles, leaving over 100 U.S. soldiers with traumatic brain injuries. That was a warning shot. A full-scale exchange would likely result in mass casualties on both sides. The families of these soldiers are watching the news tonight with a different kind of dread than the rest of us. For them, the bluff is a gamble with the lives of their sons and daughters. Furthermore, the economic fallout of a U.S. strike would be instantaneous and severe. The Strait of Hormuz acts as the jugular vein of the global economy, with a significant percentage of the world's oil supply passing through its narrow waters every single day. Iran has explicitly threatened to close this waterway if attacked. Even a partial disruption or the mining of the strait would send oil prices skyrocketing to levels that would trigger a global recession. Every American filling up their car, every business shipping goods, every family budgeting for heating would feel the impact of that strike within days. The threat is not just to military targets, it is a threat to the global economic order. As we dig deeper into the timeline of recent weeks, we uncover a series of covert signals that suggest the decision may have already been made in principle, waiting only for a trigger event. Satellite imagery analyzed by defense experts shows a dispersion of Iranian naval assets, a classic defensive maneuver anticipating an attack. Simultaneously, U.S. diplomatic staff in the region have been quietly reducing their footprint. These are not the actions of nations preparing for a summit. These are the actions of nations battening down the hatches for a storm. The bluffing phase is characterized by loud public shouting. The pre-war phase is characterized by quiet, frantic movement. We are seeing the movement. Let's analyze the trigger theory. Military planners operate on triggers. They have pre-authorized responses for specific actions. If a U.S. drone is shot down, Plan A is activated. If a U.S. ship is hit, Plan B. If an American citizen is killed, Plan C. The terrifying reality is that these triggers are often in the hands of low-level commanders or proxy militias. A rogue militia commander in Baghdad launches a rocket that unluckily hits a U.S. barracks, and suddenly, the entire machinery of the U.S. military is legally and strategically bound to respond. The president's bluff is no longer his to control. It becomes a hostage to the chaos of the battlefield. We are one stray rocket away from a war that neither president fully intends to start, but neither can stop. The psychological warfare aspect has reached a fever pitch. Cyber attacks are currently being exchanged in the shadows, targeting infrastructure, banking systems, and military networks. This is the modern prelude to kinetic war. Before the missiles launch, the screens go dark. Reports of increased cyber reconnaissance against U.S. critical infrastructure suggest that Iran is preparing its own asymmetric response. They know they cannot win a conventional war against the United States. They cannot match the air power or the naval supremacy. So they will fight in the shadows, targeting soft underbellies, cyber networks, and global terror cells. The U.S. threat to strike is met with an Iranian threat to burn the house down from the inside. This analysis continues, but we must pause to let the gravity of this situation sink in. The machinery of war is complex, and the path to conflict is paved with misunderstood intentions. In the next part of this report, we will examine the specific military scenarios being war-gamed at the Pentagon right now, and the chilling reality of what a limited strike actually looks like on the ground.